There is a place in the world where gold doesn't shine as a symbol of freedom, but as a reflection of invisible chains. Each mirror framed in silver doesn't reflect who you are, but who you should be. The palace, that monumental construction admired by multitudes, holds a secret that few dare to utter. It was never meant to house life. Behind the golden gates, far from the eyes of the subjects, lies a truth that echoes through the halls. The greatest privilege in the world has become the most sophisticated of prisons. When a child is born within these walls, they don't come into the world like any other. From their first breath, their destiny has already been written by generations that came before. The golden cradle is also a sentence. And while the world celebrates the birth of an heir, inside the palace begins the longest process of erasure. To transform a human being into a symbol, that is the sole purpose of a life that begins imprisoned. The palace has 300 rooms, but none of them are truly yours. 1,000 windows, but all overlooking the same guarded horizon. Endless corridors where each step echoes as a reminder that you are never alone. The walls covered in ancestral portraits do not decorate, they judge. Observe. Demand the continuation of a legacy that crushes anyone who dares to question it. Here, childhood is not a time for play, but for learning the weight of the crown, even before wearing it. Every stumble is analyzed by advisors. Every tear is a documented weakness. Smiling is not expressing joy, it is fulfilling protocol. The child learns early. Kings do not show weakness, and therefore, they will never be truly human. The toys are made of gold and ivory, but cannot be touched freely. Books tell stories of adventures that will never be lived. The garden stretches as far as the eye can see, but walking beyond its boundaries is unimaginable. Surrounded by everything, the child grows up in utter deprivation. The lack of choice, the supreme luxury that the palace could never offer. Each meal is a ritual where cutlery cannot make a sound and conversations follow invisible scripts. Eating is not about satisfying hunger, it's about staging civilization, demonstrating control, proving mastery over basic impulses. Breakfast has a set time. Dinner is a public performance, even without an audience. In this palace, even hunger obeys protocol. Clothes are chosen by committees that debate the meaning of each color, each fabric, each button. Getting dressed is not a personal act. It's a political statement you don't write. The wardrobe has thousands of pieces, but you don't choose any of them. Every morning, someone decides who you will be, and you merely wear the costume of a life that never belonged to you. At 15, when teenagers are discovering who they are, you've already given up on that search. Not because you don't want to, but because you've learned that identity is a luxury for those who weren't born symbols. Your tastes are irrelevant compared to the expectations of millions. Your passions need approval. At the age when life should explode with possibilities, yours closes in on a single certainty. You will never be free. Love, when it arrives, doesn't come with freedom of choice. Each suitor is analyzed, investigated, approved by everyone but you. Marriage doesn't celebrate feelings, it establishes an alliance, guarantees succession, photographs, continuity for generations, and you realize it too late. Even love, within the palace, is just another duty fulfilled under constant surveillance. The honeymoon unfolds according to a pre-approved itinerary, with photographers documenting an intimacy that never existed. Returning to the palace reveals that not even marriage brings privacy. Separate rooms dictated by protocol, meetings scheduled by secretaries. The walls whisper every word to attentive advisors. You married not for companionship, but to share your solitude with someone equally imprisoned. Children are born, and the cycle repeats itself with mathematical cruelty. You, who know every room in this prison, cradle in your arms the next victim of the same fate. You want to say run away, but whisper you will be great, because the palace doesn't allow honesty. Each kiss on the forehead is also an apology for perpetuating the confinement. Motherhood here isn't about giving life, it's merely ensuring the cage has new occupants. Growing old in this place means realizing you've spent decades without ever making a truly personal decision. You look back and see only fulfilled commitments, followed protocols, forced smiles for cameras that never stop. Wrinkles don't tell stories of lived experience as they mark years of restraint, of swallowed words, of feeling everything but expressing nothing. The mirror shows someone the world recognizes, but you yourself no longer know who you are. Official portraits will show dignity, composure, majesty for eternity. No one will paint the night you cried, locked in the bathroom, the only place without cameras. No one will record the moment you envied the gardener for having the freedom to leave at the end of the day. History will remember your reign, but will completely forget the person you could have been if you hadn't been born within these walls. The palace has state-of-the-art security, but it's not against intruder sits to ensure no one leaves. The cameras don't monitor external threats. They monitor you doing your job. The guards don't protect your life. They protect the institution you represent. And the cruelest irony is that all of this is sold as privilege. You should be grateful for the golden cage. Feel honored to be the admired but never freed bird. At night, when the lights go out and the tourists leave, the palace reveals its true nature. The silence is not beset, is a deafening emptiness of unlived lives. The corridors echo the footsteps of imprisoned generations. The rooms hold screams muffled by centuries of decorum. Lying on a mattress worth more than entire houses, you feel chains that no one sees. The impossibility of being anything other than what you were born to represent. Madness, when it comes, is almost a relief, because it means that some part still resists. History books will call it eccentricity, peculiar royal behavior, but those who live here know it's just the mind doing what the body can't escape. Even if it's into itself, anywhere but this gilded prison where sanity is a required sacrifice. Generations pass, and the palace remains, ever more beautiful on the outside, ever more dead on the inside. Tourists take photos in awe. Historians write about the power emanating from those walls. Children dream of being princesses, and no one realizes they are admiring the most efficient prison ever built. The one that convinced the whole world that its victims are privileged when, in reality, they are merely willing prisoners. The greatest cruelty of the palace is not the physical confinement, it's the impossibility of complaining about it. How can you complain about a prison when everyone says you live in paradise? How can you explain loneliness when you're surrounded by servants, or lack of freedom when you have access to everything? The palace robs you not only of your life, but also the right to lament this loss. Before a world that only sees glamour, some die young, and the world mourns the tragedy without understanding that it was liberation. Finally free from the golden chains, the watchful eyes, the crushing expectations that cannot fit within a human body. The funeral is majestic. Speeches exalt the legacy. But inside the coffin lies someone who never had a chance to discover who they were. An entire life, lived as a draft of a character written by others, who died without ever having been fully born. And so the palace remains, through the centuries, immutable and magnificent, guarding not history, but echoes of interrupted lives. Each stone was cemented with the tears of those who had to live there. Each gold reflects not light, but disturbing truth. The greatest prison of humanity never had bars or padlocks, never needed armed guards, because it convinced its victims that they were privileged, and the whole world that it was glory, when it was always just confinement dressed in majesty.